wake of Qin Shi Huang's death, the land lay in ruins, ravaged by rebellion and chaos. The mighty empire that had once boasted of unity and iron-fisted control had crumbled, leaving only a vacuum of power. The tombs of the fallen kings lay abandoned in the desolate windswept plains, their once strong walls now nothing more than fractured remnants. The Qin Dynasty, the unifier of China, was no more. Yet, amid the devastation, the story of a new empire was just beginning to unfold. The silent echoes of a shattered empire reverberated across the land, while the ruins of Xi'an stood as a grim testament to the downfall of what was once the mightiest force in China. The palace, once bustling with life and power, was now reduced to dust and decay, the remnants of a world that had crumbled under the weight of its own ambition. The faint winds of revolution carried the whispers of new hopes, as men and women across the land dared to dream of something different, something better. It was in these very ruins, in the heart of this despair, that Liu Bang, a mere sheriff born of humble means, rose to challenge the forces that had caused the empire's fall. He stood at the crossroads of history, where only two paths lay before him, one of submission and the other of rebellion. It was here, on this crumbling foundation, that his legacy would be forged. Liu Bang's decision to defy the fading Qin Empire was not simply the decision of a man, but the beginning of a movement that would reshape the course of history. Who was he, a former lowly sheriff, to stand against the might of the fractured kingdoms that now stretched across the land? Yet, as he gathered his followers, outcasts, displaced peasants, and freed prisoners, he knew that the fate of the empire was no longer bound to the bloodlines of the elite. This was the birth of the Han Dynasty, and with it, a new order would rise from the ashes of the old. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, we'll walk through the rise, glory, and collapse of the Han Dynasty. From Liu Bang's rebellion to the empire's peak and its eventual fall, this journey will uncover the key events and figures that shaped one of China's greatest dynasties. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button. If you're not subscribing, we'd love to hear why in the comments. Your feedback means a lot. The ruins of Xi'an were a silent testament to the fall of the Qin Dynasty, an empire that had once unified the fractured Chinese states with ruthless efficiency. As the wind swept through the broken arches and crumbled columns, it whispered the forgotten tales of a people who had lived under the iron fist of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. His vision for a unified empire had been vast, his ambition boundless. But now, all that remained were the remnants of a glory that had been built on fear and oppression. The grandiose palaces that once stood as symbols of imperial power were now little more than hollow shells, their stone faces worn and weathered by time. The imperial gates, which had once marked the entrance to a city of wealth and order, hung crookedly from their rusted hinges. Xi'an, the capital of the Qin Empire, had been a city of brilliance and might, yet now it lay in ruins, the silent echoes of its former glory reverberating through the empty streets. What was once a bustling hub of political life was now consumed by silence. The clash of swords and shouted commands had been replaced by the soft rustle of wind blowing through the gaps in shattered walls. The destruction of Xi'an wasn't just physical, it was symbolic of a far deeper decay, a decay that had permeated the heart of the Qin Empire. From the emperor's obsession with immortality to the relentless labor forced upon the peasants to build monuments to his glory, the seeds of the empire's collapse were sown long before the final bricks fell. Xi'an had been a place of grandeur, and now it was a place of desolation. The cracked foundations, the torn banners, the burnt remnants of once proud monuments. Each broken piece was a testament to the fragility of power. In the wake of Qin Shi Huang's death, the empire had splintered, divided by internal corruption, rebellion, and the tyranny of his successors. The great walls that once symbolized unity and strength now lay crumbling, exposing the inherent weakness within the Qin system, a system built not on love or loyalty, but on fear. As the travelers passed through the ruins, the destruction of Xi'an became more than just a symbol of loss. It was a mirror of the collapse of a vision. What had begun as an empire forged through bloodshed and conquest had unraveled into a hollow shell, leaving behind only empty streets and shattered dreams. In the dead silence of the ruined city, one could almost hear the echoes of the past, the cries of the oppressed, the death of those who dared defy the emperor, the screams of the rebels who brought down the Qin's reign. But amid this desolation, something new stirred. The vacuum left by the fall of the Qin Empire was immense, and where there was emptiness, there was also opportunity. It was not just the end of one era, it was the beginning of another. The remnants of Xi'an's stone walls would soon bear witness to the rise of a new empire, one born not of tyranny and conquest, but of rebellion and hope. In the ashes of the Qin dynasty, the seeds of the Han Dynasty were being sown. And so it was here, in the empty streets of Xi'an, where Liu Bang began his journey. The ruins, once a symbol of absolute power, now became the catalyst for a new order. What had been reduced to rubble would soon give way to the Han Dynasty, an empire founded not on oppression, but on the promise of freedom and opportunity. Liu Bang, a simple sheriff turned rebel, stood at the crossroads of history. And as he looked upon the broken stones that had once been the seat of the Qin Empire, he could feel the weight of history pressing upon him. It was in these very ruins that the world would change, and the old empire would be buried, its power fading into the dust of the past. The collapse of the Qin Empire was not a moment of sudden rupture, but rather the slow unraveling of a dynasty built on fear, control, and repression. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, had unified a fractured land under his iron fist, but in doing so, he sowed the seeds of his own destruction. His reign, though grand in ambition, was defined by tyranny, his obsession with immortality, and his belief in the absolute power of the emperor. Qin Shi Huang's vision of a unified empire was built on the backs of the people. To maintain control, he imposed severe laws, forcing the population into labor camps to construct massive infrastructure projects, including the Great Wall of China. While this massive wall was designed to protect the empire from external threats, it was also a symbol of the emperor's paranoia, a constant reminder of the insecurity at the heart of his rule. The human cost of such projects was staggering. Thousands of workers, many of them peasants, were conscripted into these tasks, starved, worked to death, or left to die from disease. The emperor's unyielding ambition exacted a price that would eventually unravel the empire's fabric. Beyond physical toll, Qin Shi Huang's relentless quest for immortality, a pursuit driven by his belief that death could be conquered through alchemy and mysticism, was another cornerstone of his empire's collapse. Desperate to secure his dynasty's future, he sought out elixirs and sent expeditions to find the secret of eternal life. His paranoia intensified. Scholars who dared question the emperor's vision were buried alive, and books that contradicted his ideology were burned, destroying the intellectual fabric of the empire. His death, in 210 BC, was not just the loss of a leader, but the death of the dream of eternal control. When Qin Shi Huang passed, the empire he had so meticulously constructed began to crumble. The immediate aftermath of his death was not the peace of a secure future, but the chaos of a fractured state. The empire, which had been built on the foundation of a single, unchallenged ruler, was now left without direction. His son, Qin Shi, ascended to the throne, but his reign was weak and ineffective. Lacking the strength and foresight of his father, he fell under the sway of the court, eunuchs and ministers who had their own agendas. The once mighty Qin bureaucracy began to deteriorate under the weight of corruption and internal strife. Simultaneously, the power vacuum left by Qin Shi Huang's death sparked a wave of uprisings across the empire. The oppressive burden of heavy taxation, forced labor, and the suffering of the common people erupted into rebellion. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, two leaders of a peasant revolt, became symbolic of the broader discontent across China. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, which would follow in the coming decades, was but one example of the widespread resistance against the Qin regime's cruelty. For the ordinary people, this moment of anarchy was more than a political struggle. It was a moment of existential crisis. The system they had lived under for generations was now collapsing, and with it, their sense of security. The marketplaces were no longer bustling with trade. The roads, once filled with soldiers and merchants, were now empty, abandoned to the chaos of civil war. Peasants, who had once been part of the rigid structure of labor under Qin Shi Huang, were now left to navigate a world that was no longer ruled by a singular, unyielding power. And yet, in the midst of this destruction, the conditions for rebirth were taking shape. The fall of the Qin dynasty didn't simply signal the death of an empire. It created the opportunity for something new to rise from the ashes. Into this vacuum stepped Liu Bang, a man who, in many ways, embodied the hope of the oppressed and the restoration of order. Liu Bang's rise was not an accident. The power struggles of the fractured Qin Empire created a fertile ground for a leader who could unite the disillusioned masses. As rebels and warlords clashed for dominance, Liu Bang, once a lowly sheriff, found himself standing at the precipice of history. His army, a mixture of peasants, former prisoners, and discontented soldiers, grew in numbers as word spread that Liu Bang represented a new vision, one of freedom, not oppression. Where others sought to seize the throne by force, Liu Bang understood that the empire needed unity, not just conquest. He wasn't merely interested in ruling the remnants of the Qin. He wanted to create a new world order, one that was rooted in the people's desire for peace and prosperity, not the tyranny of the past. And as the fall of the Qin made way for his rise, the Han Dynasty began to take shape, not as a mere continuation of Qin rule, but as something altogether new. Liu Bang's success was, in many ways, written in the chaos of the Qin's downfall. He seized the moment when empire and order were in flux, and offered the people of China the promise of a new beginning. As the Qin Empire fractured, the Han Dynasty emerged not as a power that crushed the people's spirit, but as one that lifted them up. In the ruins of Qin's ambition, Liu Bang found the path to greatness, not through destruction, but through rebuilding a unified China based on justice, hope, and the lessons of the past. Liu Bang's decision to rebel was not born from a single moment of clarity, but from the quiet accumulation of suffering and frustration. As a lowly sheriff under the brutal rule of the Qin Empire, Liu Bang had witnessed the effects of Qin Shi Huang's tyrannical reign, the relentless forced labor, the crippling taxes, and the dehumanizing control the emperor wielded over the lives of the people. The Qin Empire had built its power on the backs of the oppressed and the weak, and as it crumbled after Qin Shi Huang's death, so did the lives of millions who had been crushed beneath its weight. Liu Bang, however, was not just another rebel. He had grown up in a small village where the harshness of the emperor's decrees was keenly felt, where the unrelenting labor for the construction of the Great Wall had taken the lives of many. Like so many others, Liu Bang had borne the brunt of the Qin's demands, and his own experiences with the regime had made him no stranger to suffering. Yet, unlike others who might have sought revenge, Liu Bang's decision to act was not driven solely by personal loss or hatred. It was a calculated rebellion. He saw something that many others had missed: a power vacuum. The empire was crumbling, and where there was emptiness, there was an opportunity to create something new. The moment of choice came late one evening, under the cold light of a fading moon. Liu Bang stood before the prisoners, shackled and bruised from their forced labor on the Great Wall, their eyes dimmed by exhaustion and years of enslavement. The chains that bound them were not just physical, they were symbolic of the oppression that had governed every aspect of life in the Qin Empire. In those moments, Liu Bang's thoughts were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He knew that freeing them was an act of defiance, but he also knew that it could mean his own death. The laws of the Qin were absolute, and anyone who challenged the emperor's will faced brutal punishment. And yet, Liu Bang's humanity, a characteristic he had long kept hidden beneath the hardened exterior of a soldier, compelled him to act. The chains of these men were not just physical, but they were the same chains that bound Liu Bang himself, a man who had lived in the shadow of Qin Shi Huang's empire for years, watching as the people bled under the weight of unjust laws. To free these prisoners was to act not only as their liberator, but as the symbol of something greater, the possibility that the people could rise from the ashes of the Qin Empire and create a new order. His mind, for a moment, felt clearer than it ever had before. This was more than an act of compassion. It was an opportunity to change the world. As Liu Bang knelt down to unlock the chains, his heart pounded in his chest. He was keenly aware of the risk. The guards, the soldiers who would soon notice the disappearance of these men. He could hear the whispers of the Qin spies who would report his actions and the retribution that would follow. But despite the fear, the growing unease in his chest, and the doubts that crept into his mind, there was something else, a burning desire for change, the certainty that something had to be done, or all would be lost. As the metal clinked on the ground, breaking the silence of the prison, the prisoners, at first unsure of what had just occurred, began to realize that their chains had been removed. The weight of their oppression had lifted, if only momentarily. But in that brief moment, the possibility of freedom became more than just an abstract idea. It was now tangible. Liu Bang's act was not a flash of rebellion. It was a quiet spark, one that would ignite a fire of resistance that could spread across the land. Liu Bang's decision was not born out of a moment of grandiose ambition to rule. It was born out of humanity. It was the decision of a man who saw suffering and chose to change it. It was a calculated act, but also one fueled by the deep moral conviction that, in the wake of the Qin collapse, someone had to stand up and offer a better way, a way that wasn't built on tyranny or bloodshed, but on the hope of the people. In that quiet act, Liu Bang became more than just a sheriff. He became a symbol of the possibility of a new world. His humanity, his ability to see the value in a life oppressed by the weight of tyranny, would become the bedrock of the Han Dynasty. But it was not just his rebellion that was significant. It was the hope he carried into the world, a hope that the Qin Empire's collapse had made clear. The old order was dead, and the future could now be shaped by those brave enough to seize it. This was the beginning of Liu Bang's rise, but also the beginning of a new era, an era where the people would have a voice and where freedom could once again be within reach. The empire may have fallen, but in its place a new hope had been born. And as the freed prisoners scattered into the night, they carried with them not just their freedom, but the knowledge that something new was rising, and they would be a part of it. When Liu Bang first stood in front of the men who would become his followers, he was still far from the legendary founder of the Han Dynasty. At this moment, he was merely a sheriff in a rural village, caught in the turbulent currents of a collapsing empire. The Qin Empire, in its final days, was not a place of unity, but one of decay and desperation. The emperor had died, and the world Liu Bang knew was falling apart. His initial rebellion wasn't born out of grand ambition, but out of sheer necessity and the realization that he could no longer remain silent. In the early days of his leadership, Liu Bang did not command an army of seasoned soldiers or experienced generals. His army was made up of ordinary men, disillusioned peasants, and freed prisoners, most of whom had never wielded a weapon before. These were people who had been broken by the oppressive rule of the Qin dynasty, men who had known nothing but suffering. What Liu Bang offered them was not simply the prospect of victory, but the promise of a new life, a world where they would no longer be subjugated by the whims of a tyrant. The leadership Liu Bang displayed in these early days was grounded not in military strategy or political savvy, but in his understanding of human nature. Unlike the Qin rulers, who governed through fear and intimidation, Liu Bang was a man of compassion. His leadership was based on empathy. He knew what it meant to suffer, to live in the shadow of tyranny, and to dream of a different world. This understanding of his followers' pain gave him an edge that others lacked. Where Qin generals ruled with brutality, Liu Bang inspired loyalty through shared experience. In the early days, he organized his followers through something more than military discipline. He inspired them through belief. Liu Bang did not see himself as a distant commander. He saw himself as a fellow man who had walked the same path as his soldiers. When he freed the prisoners, it was not an act of pure altruism, but a calculated decision to show them that he was different from the empire that had enslaved them. By sharing in their suffering, he invited them into a cause greater than themselves, one that was built on justice and the promise of a better future. Liu Bang's leadership style wasn't without its challenges. The early days were marked by internal struggles and the complex dynamics of his growing army. There were many factions within his ranks: the peasants, who sought a leader that would give them justice; the prisoners, who sought freedom from the shackles of their past; and the disillusioned soldiers, who had once fought for the Qin, but now saw in Liu Bang a chance for redemption. It was Liu Bang's ability to unify these disparate groups around a common cause that set him apart. His early leadership wasn't defined by rigid military orders, but by his ability to connect with the people under his command. One of the most important aspects of Liu Bang's leadership was his ability to inspire loyalty, not through fear or coercion, but through trust and shared purpose. In the chaos following the death of Qin Shi Huang, many of the people Liu Bang led were skeptical, hesitant to follow a leader who had no military pedigree or noble lineage. Yet Liu Bang's personal charisma and his honesty spoke to them in ways that words alone could not. He was not a leader who ruled from afar. He was a man who fought alongside his soldiers, shared their struggles, and embodied the values of the people he sought to serve. In these early days, Liu Bang faced not just the external challenges of battling the remnants of the Qin forces, but the internal challenge of managing a coalition army that lacked the structure and training of traditional military forces. His ability to adapt to the needs of his diverse followers was key. He understood that a well-disciplined army was not built solely through military drills, but through the spirit of unity and the will of the people. In the heat of battle, Liu Bang relied not just on tactics, but on the strength of his people's resolve, and on the belief that they were fighting for something far more than conquest. They were fighting for the right to live freely, to build a future free from the shadow of the Qin's iron rule. By 206 BC, as Liu Bang's forces began to make their mark on the fractured land of China, his leadership had taken on a new dimension. It was no longer just about rebellion, it was about building a new order. Liu Bang's understanding of the human heart, his ability to relate to the struggles of the ordinary people, and his willingness to stand in the trenches with his followers solidified his place as a leader of men. His early victories weren't just about military might, they were about creating something lasting, a society built on shared hopes, not the oppressive rule of one man. Liu Bang's leadership in those early days wasn't the stuff of legends. It was a slow, steady rise from the ashes of rebellion. But it was these early days, marked by suffering, hope, and shared purpose, that would lay the foundation for the Han Dynasty. His ability to inspire, his willingness to fight alongside his men, and his deep empathy for the suffering of his people made him more than just a rebel leader. It made him a symbol of the future, a future that would be shaped not by tyrants, but by the people themselves. The struggle for China's future between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu was not merely a military clash. It was a contest of ideologies, of two men whose very personalities and visions would shape the destiny of a fractured empire. Both men were products of their time, but their approaches to leadership could not have been more different, and the fate of China would ultimately rest upon whose vision for the nation would prevail. Xiang Yu, born into noble blood, was the embodiment of pride and strength. He carried with him not just the weight of his lineage, but the burden of the Chu kingdom's legacy, a kingdom that had once been powerful and revered. Xiang Yu's vision of China was one where power was maintained by brutal conquest, where the might of the warrior was the only law, and where only the strongest had the right to rule. His leadership was defined by aggression and a fierce determination to restore Chu's ancient glory, even if it meant crushing everything in his path. To Xiang Yu, war was personal. It was not just about territorial conquest. It was about restoring his honor and proving that his strength could shape the future of China. His tactical decisions on the battlefield were often as reckless as they were courageous, driven by a belief that his willpower alone would ensure victory. He was a man of action, not one to sit behind desks or make compromises. His pride was both his strength and his downfall. He believed that his martial prowess could carry him through, that his ability to lead in battle would automatically translate into victory in the political arena. In contrast, Liu Bang was a man shaped not by his noble lineage, but by his humble beginnings. Born a commoner, Liu Bang understood the power of adaptability, the ability to read the room, to understand the emotions of his people, and to use those insights to his advantage. His leadership was marked by flexibility, not rigidity. While Xiang Yu sought glory through the force of his blade, Liu Bang sought it through the force of his connections, his ability to gather support, and his strategic alliances. Where Xiang Yu imposed his will through intimidation, Liu Bang earned his followers' trust through shared goals. From the very beginning, Liu Bang's approach was one of inclusivity. His army was not a machine of war, built on a rigid, hierarchical system. Instead, it was a coalition of men from all walks of life, peasants, deserters, and former prisoners, all of whom found in Liu Bang the promise of a better life, a life free from the tyranny of the Qin and Xiang Yu's unrelenting aggression. Liu Bang's leadership was less about personal glory and more about building something lasting, about creating an empire that was not just built by force, but united through compassion and mutual respect. Xiang Yu's strategic approach on the battlefield was to strike hard and fast, to overwhelm his enemies with the sheer brutality of his forces. His forces were often well-trained, disciplined, and focused on direct confrontation. This worked in the short term, but his overconfidence led to missteps that Liu Bang, the more pragmatic strategist, was able to exploit. Xiang Yu's tendency to charge headlong into battle, driven by pride, often left him vulnerable. His soldiers were driven by fear of his wrath and were not inspired by the same loyalty that Liu Bang's men felt for him. Liu Bang, on the other hand, was a master of psychological warfare. He understood that to win battles, one must first win the hearts and minds of the people, and that the true strength of an army was not in the number of soldiers, but in the resolve of those soldiers to fight for a cause greater than themselves. Liu Bang was no stranger to strategy. He used his knowledge of terrain, his ability to anticipate his enemy's moves, and his skill in forming key alliances to outmaneuver Xiang Yu on more than one occasion. Liu Bang's army, though smaller in size, was more adaptable, capable of shifting strategies based on the situation, and united by a shared belief in Liu Bang's vision for a just and unified China. Xiang Yu's pride eventually led him to underestimate Liu Bang's resolve. He dismissed Liu Bang as an unworthy opponent, seeing him as nothing more than a low-born sheriff who had risen by luck. This arrogance would prove to be his undoing. Xiang Yu, in his determination to fight a decisive battle, ignored the psychological toll his reckless actions had on his own soldiers and the people he was supposed to lead. His failure to adapt his tactics to the changing political landscape sealed his fate. The pride that had made him an invincible warrior also blinded him to the broader picture of what was needed to build a lasting empire. Liu Bang's vision for China was rooted not in pride or dominance, but in the belief that true power was in the unity of the people. His empire would not be forged in the heat of battle alone, but in the hearts of the people who believed in him. This was the fundamental difference between the two men. Xiang Yu saw China as a prize to be claimed, but Liu Bang saw it as a nation to be built, brick by brick, ally by ally, until it stood as a beacon of hope for all. In the end, it was Liu Bang's adaptability, his humanity, and his ability to unite disparate factions that allowed him to triumph over Xiang Yu's pride. It was not brute force, but the vision of a leader who saw the strength in others, who understood that the future of China would not be shaped by the sword alone, but by the hearts and minds of those willing to fight for it. Liu Bang's victory was not just the defeat of Xiang Yu, it was the beginning of a new China, one that would rise from the ruins of the Qin dynasty and into an era of unity, justice, and humanity. When Xiang Yu and Liu Bang faced off in battle, it was not just the clash of armies, but a collision of two radically different worldviews and psychologies. Theirs was the struggle that reached deep into their identities, into their understanding of power, and into what they believed China's future should be. Xiang Yu, with his pride, and Liu Bang, with his adaptability, could not have been more different. But the decisions they made, driven by their psychological motivations, would not only shape their personal destinies, but also the course of Chinese history. Xiang Yu's pride was the driving force of his identity. Born to a family with noble lineage, Xiang Yu carried the weight of the Chu kingdom's past glory and the responsibility of restoring its former power. His sense of honor was inextricably linked to his personal strength, and he believed that conquering and dominating was the only way to assert his right to rule. Xiang Yu was a man defined by his martial prowess, a warrior who believed that physical might was not only a reflection of power, but the ultimate measure of a leader's worth. His aggressive style of warfare was a direct expression of his belief that only by overcoming opponents decisively could a leader prove his supremacy. This pride, however, became his greatest flaw. Xiang Yu's desire to assert dominance led him to make decisions driven by emotion rather than long-term strategy. His decimation of Xiyang, a symbol of the Qin's former strength, was not merely about military conquest. It was a statement. Xiang Yu was wiping the slate clean, erasing the legacy of the Qin, and reaffirming that the Chu kingdom was now the rightful heir to China. But in doing so, he failed to see the long-term consequences. His desire for immediate gratification, the destruction of his enemies, blindly pushed him into decisions that would later come back to haunt him. By destroying Xiang, he symbolically eradicated any possibility of reconciliation with the people who had lived under the Qin's brutal rule. It was an act of prideful vengeance, but it also alienated potential supporters who saw in the Qin's collapse an opportunity for reconstruction, not annihilation. Liu Bang, on the other hand, was a man of adaptability, a leader who rose from the lowest ranks of society to challenge an empire that seemed indomitable. His early life had been shaped by the humble hardships of being a lowly sheriff in a broken society, and it was through these experiences that he learned the value of strategic patience and human connection. Unlike Xiang Yu, who sought to dominate through violence and pride, Liu Bang saw power as something that could be built through alliances and understanding. He knew that the people of China, who had suffered under the Qin, would not follow a leader who sought to impose his will by force alone. Liu Bang's decision to show mercy in the aftermath of the battle reflected his unique approach to power. Where Xiang Yu sought to erase the past through destruction, Liu Bang saw the future in reconciliation. When he entered Xi'an after its ruin, instead of repeating the pride-driven violence of his rival, he chose to offer mercy to the surviving inhabitants. This decision was more than just an act of kindness. It was a calculated move that spoke to his understanding of what China needed in the wake of the Qin collapse. By showing mercy, Liu Bang positioned himself as a unifier, not a conqueror. He demonstrated that true power lay in healing, in bringing the people together after the devastation of the Qin, and in building a nation that could rise from the ashes of tyranny. Liu Bang's choice was not without its psychological stakes, though. It was a decision that required immense courage. Mercy in a time of war could easily be perceived as weakness. His soldiers, many of whom had suffered greatly under the Qin, might have expected more bloodshed, more vengeance. But Liu Bang understood that violence would only perpetuate the cycle of fear and resentment. His leadership was built not on revenge, but on the hope for something better. A better future for China, where the people could rebuild under a government based on justice and mutual respect. The psychological stakes for both leaders were clear. Xiang Yu's destruction of Xi'an was not just an act of military conquest. It was a desperate attempt to assert control and prove his worth as the heir to China's throne. But in doing so, he showed his inability to see the larger picture. His need for personal glory clouded his judgment, and his pride ultimately became his downfall. Liu Bang, however, was able to see beyond the immediate rewards of victory. He understood that real power was not about winning battles, but about winning the hearts and minds of the people. His decision to show mercy, to offer hope where others would have offered destruction, marked him as the leader who would rebuild, not just conquer. This decision, in the aftermath of the battle, was a defining moment in Liu Bang's rise. His victory was not just about defeating Xiang Yu, it was about proving that a new era was dawning, one in which leadership would be defined not by fear or domination, but by compassion, unity, and the shared hope of a nation seeking to rebuild itself. In this moment, Liu Bang's mercy became the cornerstone of a future China, where strength was measured not by how much one could destroy, but by how much one could heal. In the summer of 202 BC, Liu Bang stood in the grand hall of the Xianyang Palace, now transformed into the seat of the Han Dynasty. The once humble sheriff, who had risen from the dust of rebellion, now stood before a court of nobles, generals, and ministers as Emperor Gaozu of Han. His coronation was not just the formalization of his rule, it was the moment when the reality of leadership settled in. His hands, which had once held only the sword of rebellion, now grasped the imperial seal, a symbol of both power and responsibility. Liu Bang was no stranger to struggle. His rise had been long and filled with bloodshed, but now he was tasked with building something greater than the mere collapse of the Qin Empire. He had fought for the people, yes, but now, as emperor, he had to lead all the people, not just the peasants or the soldiers who had followed him, but the nobles, the court, and the very dynasty that he had just founded. The weight of the throne was heavier than any battlefield, for on it rested the future of China itself. As he sat upon the throne, an emperor in name, Liu Bang could not ignore the complexity of the moment. His moral convictions, which had driven his rebellion, now had to contend with the harsh realities of governance. Legitimacy as emperor was not simply about wearing the crown. It was about holding power and consolidating it through alliances, compromise, and yes, at times, through ruthlessness. His early days would demand more than just the humanity and compassion that had won him the support of his followers. Liu Bang knew that strong governance required the ability to make decisions that were not always popular, but necessary. His first political challenge came almost immediately: how to balance his personal values, the ideals of justice, compassion, and unity, with the pragmatic demands of ruling an empire. Liu Bang had always prided himself on listening to his people, to the farmers, the soldiers, and the peasants who he had risen with him in rebellion. Yet now he found himself surrounded by the aristocracy, former enemies, and generals who had fought alongside him, but who now sought to secure their own power within the new order. Early decisions revealed the complexity of his leadership. He granted land and titles to many of his generals, rewarding them for their loyalty. Yet this was a double-edged sword. By elevating these men, he ensured their loyalty, but he also created powerful rivals within his court. Some of these men, like Han Xin, his general, were pivotal to his military victories, but others, like Lu Zhe, his wife, and Xiao He, his strategist, were deeply involved in court politics and the internal balancing act. Liu Bang had to ensure these figures maintained respect and loyalty, even as they pursued their own ambitions. His decision to appoint Han Xin as the king of Chu was a testament to his need to balance military power with loyalty, but it also set the stage for future rivalries. The early Han court was fractured. While Liu Bang understood the importance of compromise, the court he inherited was one of factions. His mercy towards Xiang Yu's supporters, even after the defeat of Xiang Yu in 202 BC, was an example of his willingness to forgive, yet also a politically necessary compromise. He needed the support of Xiang Yu's generals to stabilize his empire, but his forgiveness came at the cost of strengthening potential rivals. It was a decision that would haunt him, for many of those he spared would go on to challenge his power in the years to come. Liu Bang's humanity, his desire to offer amnesty and peace, was noble, but it also showed the tensions between his ideals and the practicalities of governance. Despite his idealism, Liu Bang quickly found that leadership often demanded difficult choices. Trusting his generals, though essential to his military success, came at the risk of creating a fragile balance of power. His compromise with Xiang Yu's generals was an attempt to unite the kingdom, but it also meant that he would have to navigate internal conflict and military challenges as different factions jostled for supremacy. His decision to accept former Qin officials into his administration was another delicate balance. While it helped him restore order, It also left him vulnerable to criticism for co-opting the same bureaucratic system that had once oppressed the people. In his personal life, Liu Bang faced another challenge. The influence of Lu Di, his wife, and the empress, while valuable in securing alliances with the powerful families, also became a point of tension. Her political savvy often clashed with Liu Bang's more flexible and compassionate nature. In many ways, Lu Zi's ambitions were not aligned with Liu Bang's vision of a just empire that listened to the people. Their complex relationship would define much of the Han Dynasty's early years, as power struggles at court mirrored the larger struggles for control across China. These early compromises, while politically necessary, would come to define Liu Bang's reign. His ability to balance mercy with power, justice with governance, was the core of his leadership. However, the decisions made in the early years would shape the Han Dynasty's future. Liu Bang's ability to consolidate power through strategic alliances, military victories, and shrewd political maneuvering allowed the Han Dynasty to endure for centuries, but his commitment to justice, even at the cost of his own power, was both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. As Liu Bang sat on the throne, the weight of the imperial seal was heavy, not just with the responsibility of ruling, but with the knowledge that his reign was the foundation of a dynasty that would need to endure beyond him. His choices, strategic compromises, alliances, and political moves would create the legacy of the Han Dynasty, a dynasty that would rise from rebellion, endure through governance, and create a lasting empire built not just on the sword, but on the strength of unity, trust, and compromise. The reign of Emperor Wen of Han, AD 180 to 157 BC, marked a profound shift in China's imperial trajectory, not merely as a political ruler, but as a visionary who sought to create an empire grounded in the virtues of peace and humility. His coronation, following the turbulence of the Qin collapse and the chaos of the Chu-Han contention, was a momentous occasion. It was not just the accession of a new emperor, it was the birth of a dynasty rooted in a more benevolent Confucian ideal of governance. Emperor Wen's reign would be defined by a calm that the empire had not known for decades, marked by frugality and a commitment to moderation. Yet, the peace of his rule was not just the absence of war, it was the conscious construction of a new order, founded on the moral principles of Confucianism. Emperor Wen's leadership was characterized by humility and restraint, and it began with a profound shift in the empire's priorities. Having ascended to the throne as the second emperor of the Han Dynasty, he understood the empire's need to recover from the ravages of war and the excesses of Qin authoritarianism. While the Qin had ruled through brutality and legalism, Emperor Wen's approach was rooted in benevolence and moderation. He recognized that peace was not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of social harmony, something that could only be achieved through moral leadership and the restoration of virtue. This ethos of frugality defined much of Emperor Wen's reign. Where his predecessors had indulged in extravagant palaces and grandiose public works, Emperor Wen insisted on the simplicity of his court and the modesty of his administration. His palace was a far cry from the opulence of the Qin, and his personal lifestyle reflected the values he sought to instill in the empire. He was careful with state funds, ensuring that the imperial treasury was not depleted by unnecessary spending. Taxes were reduced, and the burden on the peasantry was lightened, an approach that directly impacted the lives of the common people. Unlike the oppressive taxation of the Qin dynasty, which drained the life out of the farmers, Emperor Wen sought to restore the balance of agriculture by giving farmers more control over the fruits of their labor. This created a sense of loyalty and gratitude among the peasantry, who saw in the emperor a ruler who had their welfare at heart. The impact on the common people was immediate and far-reaching. The economic reforms that Emperor Wen introduced, reduced taxes, lighter forced labor obligations, and policies that encouraged agricultural production, were designed to ensure the prosperity of the people. Farmers were granted more autonomy, and the burdens of the past were lightened. In this era of peace, many in the empire could finally breathe easy, knowing that they would no longer be crushed under the weight of excessive taxation and forced labor. The restoration of prosperity brought with it a new sense of security that permeated the empire from its southern borders to its northern frontiers. However, the implementation of these reforms was not without challenges. The influence of Confucianism permeated not just the imperial court, but the very structure of the Han government. Emperor Wen, although embracing Confucian ideals, faced the difficult task of reforming the imperial bureaucracy, a task that demanded pragmatism and the balancing of idealism with realpolitik. Confucianism, with its emphasis on virtuous rulers and the meritocratic selection of officials, was not immediately accepted by the entrenched aristocracy. Many of the old elites, who had held positions of power under the Qin and Han Gaozu, resisted this change. Yet Emperor Wen, with his characteristic patience and strategic wisdom, was able to integrate Confucian values into the fabric of the state, though it was a slow process. Under his reign, the imperial bureaucracy became increasingly meritocratic. While the Confucian model for selecting officials based on virtue and education was not fully realized immediately, Emperor Wen made critical steps toward its implementation. The Confucian examination system, though not fully established until the reign of his successors, took root during his time. Confucian scholars were increasingly recruited for their knowledge of the classics and their moral integrity rather than their noble birth. Emperor Wen's reliance on wise and virtuous men like Xiao He, his chief minister, and the emphasis on education as the basis for official appointments helped to stabilize the empire and ensured that the administration was not only efficient but also morally guided. However, this meritocratic approach had its limits. Emperor Wen's ideal of a virtuous and educated bureaucracy was not always reflected in the actions of his officials. While many officials adhered to Confucian principles of benevolence, others were less committed to these ideals, and corruption remained a challenge. Yet the emperor's policies provided a framework that future emperors would build upon, and by Emperor Wu's reign, 141 to 87 BC, the imperial bureaucracy would be far more aligned with Confucian ideals. For Emperor Wen, the introduction of Confucianism into governance wasn't about immediate perfection, but about laying the foundation for a more just and stable empire. The long-term effects of Emperor Wen's Confucian-based governance were felt throughout the Han Dynasty. His reign laid the groundwork for a stable, prosperous empire that would endure for centuries. The values of virtue and merit, which were instilled in the imperial administration, became the hallmark of the Han government, ensuring that the empire was ruled not just by force, but by the wisdom, virtue of its rulers and officials. The moral governance that Emperor Wen fostered helped create a public trust in the state, something that would carry the Han Dynasty through periods of hardship and ensure its eventual success. Emperor Wen's reign also introduced a cultural shift. Under his leadership, Confucianism not only shaped governance, but also influenced culture, encouraging the people to adhere to moral values such as respect for elders, loyalty to the state, and personal virtue. The empire became one where education was highly valued, and where the imperial court served as a center of learning and wisdom. In the end, Emperor Wen's reign was not just about peace. It was about the creation of a lasting legacy based on virtuous leadership, compassion, and moderation. His reforms not only restored China's economy, but set the foundation for the Han Dynasty's golden age. The influence of Confucianism continued to shape China for centuries, creating a model of governance that emphasized the importance of moral integrity, education, and merit. Emperor Wen's ability to balance virtue with pragmatism and his commitment to a just and stable society marked his reign as one of the most defining periods in Chinese history. The reign of Emperor Wu of Han was defined by his military ambitions, a vision that would stretch the Han Empire's boundaries farther than any of his predecessors could have imagined. Ascending to the throne in 141 BC, Emperor Wu's early reign was consumed by the desire to secure the empire's borders and expand its influence. His military campaigns were not merely a series of battles for land. They were a reflection of his grand vision to make the Han not only a dominant force in East Asia, but a player on the world stage. At the core of his military ambition lay the Xiongnu, the nomadic people who had posed a significant threat to the Han Empire for decades. The Xiongnu were not just military adversaries, they were the gatekeepers of the Silk Road, controlling vital trade routes that stretched from the east of China to the west, connecting the Han to Central Asia, Persia, and the Mediterranean world. The Xiongnu threat was also a political one. Under their leader, Modu Chanyu, the Xiongnu were a fierce and organized force that regularly raided Han territories and maintained a strong alliance with other steppe tribes. Emperor Wu saw this as a direct challenge to his vision of a secure, expansive Han Empire. His solution? Not negotiation, but military domination. Emperor Wu's early campaigns against the Xiongnu were rooted in determination and pragmatism. Unlike previous emperors who had used tribute and diplomacy to placate the Xiongnu, Emperor Wu pursued a decisive military approach. The years between 133 BC and 119 BC saw a series of punitive expeditions against the Xiongnu, aimed at weakening their grip on the northern frontiers and expanding Han control over the northern steppes. He did not merely seek to push back the Xiongnu, but aimed to destroy their power and create a buffer zone between the Han Empire and the nomadic threat. His military campaigns were not just defensive, they were offensive in scope, pushing Han influence into Central Asia. In 121 BC, the Han forces defeated the Xiongnu decisively at the Battle of Mobei, marking the beginning of Han dominance in the region. The Han Empire expanded its reach, securing key areas like the Tarim Basin, which would become critical for the Silk Road trade. As Emperor Wu drove the Xiongnu back, he also pursued diplomatic alliances with neighboring steppe peoples, including the Yuezhi and the Wusun, both of whom played a key role in his military strategy. This diplomatic approach showed how military power and strategic alliances went hand in hand in shaping his empire. As Han influence spread westward, Emperor Wu faced new challenges. The Xiongnu, though weakened, were still a force to be reckoned with. More importantly, the nomadic tribes of the steppe posed their own threats to stability, and maintaining control over these distant regions required careful military oversight and constant diplomatic negotiations. The further Han forces moved into Central Asia, the more difficult it became to manage such a vast empire. The supply lines for these distant military expeditions stretched thin, and the costs of maintaining military dominance over such territories began to strain the empire's resources. Yet, Emperor Wu's commitment to this military expansion was unwavering. His vision of a united, strong Han Empire required not only territorial control, but control over the vital trade routes that would enrich his dynasty. The geopolitical stakes of his campaigns were enormous. The Silk Road, the ancient highway that connected the East and the West, was more than just a trading route. It was a symbol of cultural exchange, of Han power reaching out to the world. By securing the Silk Road and defeating the Xiongnu, Emperor Wu ensured that the Han Dynasty would become a dominant force in global trade. He didn't just seek to protect the empire's borders, he sought to reshape the flow of goods, ideas, and people, positioning China as the central hub of the ancient world's commerce. But the cost of these military campaigns was immense. The further Emperor Wu pushed the Han frontier, the more his resources were strained. Military funding, along with the administrative cost of controlling distant regions like Fergana and the Tarim Basin, stretched the imperial treasury thin. The emperor's military expenditures drained the economy, causing internal dissatisfaction among the peasantry, who saw their burdens increase while the empire expanded outward. The long-term impact of these military campaigns, however, was undeniable. By 130 BC, Emperor Wu had established Han dominance over the Silk Road and had driven the Xiongnu away from the Chinese borders. His legacy as an emperor who expanded China's borders is unparalleled in early Chinese history, but his military ambition also led to the foundation of a complex bureaucracy designed to handle these far-flung territories. The newly acquired lands were divided into commanderies and provinces, managed by military and civilian officials who had to govern over ethnically diverse and often hostile populations. His expansion set the stage for the Han Dynasty's transformation into a multi-ethnic empire that would eventually need to balance imperial centralization with the autonomy of its border regions. Emperor Wu's campaigns reshaped the Han Empire's geopolitical structure and economic future. His conquest of Central Asia not only ensured control over the Silk Road, but also marked the Han Dynasty's rise as the dominant power in the region. His military and diplomatic tactics altered the balance of power in Central Asia, shifted the flow of goods and ideas, and secured his place in history as one of the most formidable military leaders China would ever see. Yet, the very expansion that brought the Han Empire such prosperity also left it with the long-term burden of maintaining and governing these far-flung regions, a challenge that future emperors would have to confront as they inherited a legacy of both glory and complexity. The reign of Emperor Wu of Han, high 141 to 87 BC, would be remembered as one of grand military ambition, shaping the destiny of the Han Dynasty and extending its influence far beyond the ancient heartlands of China. His military conquests stretched the empire's borders to unprecedented lengths, bringing the Han into Central Asia and across the Silk Road, securing the empire's economic future. But the glory of his reign was not without cost, a cost that was paid not only by the soldiers on the front lines, but also by the very structure of the empire that his victories helped build. From the outset of his reign, Emperor Wu harbored a singular vision, one of an empire unified under his control, and one that would ensure its dominance on the world stage. Unlike previous rulers who had sought peace with their northern, nomadic neighbors, Emperor Wu saw the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic tribes from the northern steppes, as a significant threat to Han supremacy. Their raids had been a constant menace, and the Silk Road, a crucial conduit for trade, was under their sway. To Emperor Wu, the security of the empire's trade routes, as well as the imperial legacy, depended on eradicating the Xiongnu threat. Emperor Wu's ambition was driven by more than a desire for military glory. It was a complex, almost existential need to ensure the perpetuity of the Han Dynasty. He envisioned a China that would not just survive, but thrive, free from the constant northern raids that had long plagued his predecessors. The strategic importance of Central Asia and its role in the Silk Road trade made it critical for Emperor Wu to push Han influence westward. He sought to break the power of the Xiongnu and extend his empire's reach, but in doing so, he invited a series of military campaigns that would stretch Han resources and manpower to their breaking point. The human cost of his military campaigns cannot be overstated. The taxation on peasants to fund the war efforts was relentless, and the constant demand for soldiers drained the countryside. In the early years of the campaigns, conscription took its toll on the farmers, whose labor was essential for the empire's survival. With vast portions of the peasantry sent off to fight, agricultural output suffered, creating widespread famine in certain regions. Though Emperor Wu's victories against the Xiongnu were heralded as monumental, the reality was that the lives of countless commoners were sacrificed on the battlefield and in the fields. The Xiongnu campaigns were lengthy, stretching over decades and taking a toll on the Han military. While the emperor's army grew in size and strength, it was also weakened by the loss of seasoned soldiers and the strain of prolonged conflict. Soldiers, who were primarily from lower classes, bore the brunt of the fighting. The military expansion and constant battles over the years caused exhaustion among the ranks, and widespread dissatisfaction began to brew among those who felt they had borne too much of the empire's burdens. These sacrifices, though contributing to his military glory, fostered resentment among the people, who were left to shoulder the aftermath of Emperor Wu's vision of empire. Moreover, the political cost of Emperor Wu's expansion was equally grave. The imperial bureaucracy, already stretched thin by the demands of governing the vast Han lands, found itself even more burdened by the need to manage newly conquered territories. His military ambitions necessitated the creation of a larger administrative apparatus to oversee the far-flung provinces and military districts, which weakened the central control of the Han court. Local governors and military commanders gained increasing power as the emperor granted them greater autonomy to govern newly acquired lands, leading to a fragmentation of power that would haunt the later years of the dynasty. Emperor Wu's reliance on military elites like Wei Qing and Huo Kubing also contributed to the political fragmentation. While these generals were essential to his victories, their growing power, in both military and political spheres, became a double-edged sword. As Emperor Wu's health declined in his later years, these military leaders who had helped build the empire began to position themselves as key players in the imperial court, laying the foundation for court intrigue and power struggles. The imperial family itself, weakened by the emperor's preoccupation with military campaigns, became embroiled in succession disputes and political rivalries that would destabilize the empire in the generations to come. While Emperor Wu's ambition achieved remarkable military success, it also led to profound political instability. His wars of expansion created an overextended empire, with newly conquered lands that were difficult to govern and whose resources could not always support the military garrisons needed to secure them. The Han treasury, drained by the prolonged conflicts, could not keep up with the demands of maintaining such a vast empire. Financial strain became a growing issue, one that ultimately led to social unrest and rebellions in the final years of Emperor Wu's reign and beyond. Despite these costs, Emperor Wu's legacy of glory endured. His conquests ensured the Han Dynasty's dominance in Central Asia and solidified its place as a key player in the world's trade networks. The Silk Road, now under Han control, flourished under his reign, bringing wealth and cultural exchange to China. But the very glory he achieved created the foundation for a legacy of difficulty, an empire built on military expansion that would later struggle to maintain control over its vast holdings. His vision, though impressive, carried within it the seeds of a dynasty that would be weakened by the very forces he unleashed. In the end, the human cost of the human. Emperor Wu's expansion, the lives of soldiers, peasants, and the strain on resources was a price that the empire could never fully repay. His military success left a legacy of territorial gains and economic prosperity, but the internal challenges and dissatisfaction sown by his policies left the Han Dynasty vulnerable to future political instability. While Emperor Wu's reign would be celebrated for its military glory, it would also be remembered as a time when the pursuit of empire led to the undeniable sacrifice of the very people who had helped build it. The rise of the eunuchs in the Han court was neither swift nor overt, but it was, in its own way, an ominous tide that slowly infiltrated the very heart of the imperial power. By the reign of Emperor Quan, 146-168 AD, the influence of eunuchs within the palace had grown exponentially. Their ascent was not solely due to their position within the palace as trusted servants and advisors. It was their shrewd manipulation of the emperor's weaknesses and the imperial family's internal struggles that allowed them to steadily encroach upon the throne's authority. At first, eunuchs served as loyal servants and guardians of the imperial family, a role that ensured their initial acceptance within the palace. But in the absence of a strong, centralized power in the early Eastern Han, as the empire's leadership fractured under weak emperors and regents, the eunuchs seized their opportunity to manipulate the delicate political situation. Over time, they began to play a more active role in court affairs, leveraging their closeness to the emperor to effectively control the imperial administration. One of the most remarkable aspects of the eunuchs' rise to power was their ability to gain influence through patronage. The eunuchs did not only act in the interests of the emperor, they began to shape imperial policy by gaining allies in the court. By offering protection, favors, and even marriage alliances with high-ranking officials, the eunuchs were able to form a powerful network that extended far beyond their original roles. They placed their own people into positions of power and influence, controlling the levers of government and imperial decision-making. This was the root of their power, not brute force, but a subtle and strategic game of alliances, manipulation, and control. Yet, the eunuchs' rise was not without its costs. As they gained more control over the imperial court, they also began to accumulate wealth. Their control over the emperor's decisions allowed them to extract wealth from officials and merchants in the form of bribes and kickbacks. This corruption spread throughout the Han administration, undermining the imperial bureaucracy. Over time, the once strong moral foundation of the Han state, which had been built on the Confucian ideals of virtue and merit, began to crack under the strain of eunuch manipulation. The political ramifications of this shift in power were far-reaching. As the eunuchs gained more influence, the traditional power structures in the Han court began to crumble. The imperial family, once the bedrock of the empire's authority, was now increasingly sidelined, its influence usurped by the eunuchs who had become the real rulers behind the throne. This power shift created tensions within the Han court, where factions formed in an attempt to either support or oppose the eunuchs' growing authority. Regents and noble families, who had traditionally held significant sway over imperial decisions, now found themselves at odds with a new ruling class, a group of eunuchs who had no loyalty to the state beyond their self-interest. The rise of the eunuchs also had severe consequences for imperial succession. They were no longer mere servants. They were now the kingmakers. Eunuchs such as Zhang Rang and Kai Yong were known for their influence in selecting emperors, and their choices were often motivated by personal gain rather than the welfare of the empire. By manipulating the imperial succession process, the eunuchs effectively ensured that only those emperors who were pliant to their influence would sit on the throne. In doing so, they perpetuated a cycle of weak emperors who were more likely to follow the eunuchs' dictates rather than rule independently. As the eunuchs tightened their grip on the throne, social unrest began to brew in the empire. The common people, who once looked to the emperor as the moral and political leader, began to see him as little more than a puppet. The influence of the eunuchs over the imperial family became a symbol of the empire's decay. By the time of Emperor Ling's reign, 168 to 189 AD, the people's disillusionment had reached a boiling point. Eunuchs, with their unchecked power and corruption, became the target of growing resentment and outrage. This dissatisfaction would later fuel the rise of rebellions, such as the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 AD, which was, in part, a response to the inequity and corruption created by the eunuchs' control. The political instability caused by the eunuchs' rise also left the Han Dynasty vulnerable to external threats. As the Han military was bogged down in internal conflicts and factional struggles, the empire's defenses grew weaker. This internal rot made the Han Empire more susceptible to the turbulent dynamics on its borders, where nomadic incursions from the Xiongnu and other groups threatened its borders. What began as a subtle rise to power eventually culminated in the eunuchs' destructive impact on the entire imperial structure. Their unchecked corruption, manipulation of imperial succession, and exploitation of emperors' weakness set in motion a cycle of instability and weak governance that would reverberate long after their fall from power. In the end, the eunuchs' rise was not just a story of corruption, but of moral decay within the Han Dynasty, and a warning of how a small group of manipulative individuals could wield immense power and destabilize an entire empire. Empress Lu Ji was a figure who, in her quiet yet ruthless pursuit of power, would shape the trajectory of the Han Dynasty in ways few could have predicted. Born into the Lu family, her strategic marriage to Emperor Gaozu placed her in a favorable position from the start. However, it was not her marriage alone that set her apart. It was her acute political mind, her ability to manipulate alliances, and her unparalleled tactical acumen in consolidating power, even in a time when the Han court was filled with frailty and instability. When Emperor Gaozu passed in 195 BC, leaving his young son, Emperor Hui, on the throne, the Han Dynasty entered a period of uncertainty. Despite the symbolic power of the emperor, the true power lay in the hands of those who could influence him. Empress Lu, no longer just the wife of the emperor, now assumed the role of regent for her son. But her political brilliance didn't stop with merely managing the empire for a child ruler. She had an insatiable desire to expand her own power and ensure that the imperial succession would remain in her hands. At the heart of Empress Lu's rise was her ability to build a network of loyalty through both blood ties and strategic alliances. She embedded her family members into the imperial bureaucracy, placing her closest kin in high-ranking government positions. But Empress Lu didn't rely solely on family. She also forged important connections with key figures in the imperial court and the military. Through strategic marriages and political favors, she managed to gain the loyalty of powerful figures, ensuring that her rule was backed by the highest authorities in the Han Empire. This careful cultivation of support allowed her to keep a tight grip on the throne. However, Empress Lu's reign was not without conflict. As her family alliances grew stronger, so did the tension within the imperial court. The military elites, who had traditionally played an important role in Han governance, began to question the growing influence of the empress and her family's control. Military generals, particularly those with their own loyalty to the emperor, felt sidelined by her increasing autocratic control. This rising tension culminated in a series of battles for power, with Empress Lu effectively eliminating rivals both within the court and the military. Her ruthlessness in handling these threats, executing or exiling those who stood in her way, solidified her dominance. Her manipulations were not just political, they were deeply personal, rooted in her ability to remove potential threats and secure the throne for her son. But while Empress Lu's actions brought short-term stability to the Han Dynasty, they also sowed the seeds for its long-term instability. Her actions often contradicted the Confucian ideals that had been a cornerstone of Han governance. Instead of promoting merit-based governance, Empress Lu's reliance on her family's loyalty and personal alliances led to widespread favoritism and corruption. This ultimately weakened the imperial system, as the government's strength relied more on family ties than merit or effective administration. The consequences of her manipulation of imperial succession were felt for generations. By controlling the imperial line and ensuring that her family had sway over imperial decisions, Empress Lu set a dangerous precedent. The court became a playground for manipulation, where power was defined not by competence, but by connections. This shift in governance left the Han increasingly vulnerable to factionalism, as rival families and military leaders vied for control. Perhaps the most telling sign of her influence's fragility was the disintegration of the central authority she had worked so hard to build. As Empress Lu's power grew, her ruthlessness increased. Her use of violence to eliminate rivals and suppress dissent led to deep fractures within the imperial family and the elite. By the time of her death in 180 BC, the Han Dynasty was left with a dysfunctional imperial structure that was unable to maintain its stability. The imperial authority had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, and the imperial court had become riddled with factionalism and backstabbing. The immediate personal consequences of opposing Empress Lu were dire. Those who dared to challenge her power faced the ultimate price: execution, imprisonment, or exile. In her eyes, there was no room for opposition. There were only allies and enemies. The toll of this political instability became particularly apparent when Empress Lu's son, Emperor Huai, grew older but remained largely ineffectual. Under her rule, the Han Dynasty saw a rise in corruption and political manipulation. Even after her death, the imperial system would remain fractured, unable to fully recover from the damage she had caused. Factions within the court, initially created by Empress Lu, would continue to plague the Han Dynasty for generations. While Empress Lu's actions provided her family with temporary control over the Han court, the consequences of her manipulations were far-reaching and ultimately destabilized the very foundations of the empire. The centralization of power in the hands of a single individual under the guise of regency showed just how fragile imperial authority could be. Her political strategies, though successful in the short term, marked a turning point in Han history, where the imperial system began to lose its coherence and moral legitimacy. Empress Lu's story serves as a stark reminder of how personal ambition, when unchecked, can corrupt and undermine even the mightiest of dynasties. As the last emperor of the Han Dynasty, Emperor Xian's reign was one defined not by strength or glory, but by weakness and powerlessness. Ascending the throne in 189 BC as a young child, Emperor Xian was handed a kingdom already in turmoil, teetering on the edge of collapse. The once mighty Han Empire, forged through the ambition of Emperor Gaozu and solidified by Emperor Wu, had already been undermined by political corruption, factionalism, and military conflict. By the time Emperor Xian was crowned, The court was rife with internal divisions, and the emperor's role was reduced to that of a mere figurehead, his authority entirely controlled by the eunuchs and warlords who ruled in his stead. In the court of Emperor Xian, power was no longer derived from the imperial throne. It was dispersed and fragmented among powerful figures who held sway over the emperor. The eunuchs, once trusted servants and guardians of the imperial family, had slowly infiltrated the highest echelons of the Han government, quietly consolidating power while the emperor, increasingly isolated, watched helplessly. By the time Emperor Xian ascended the throne, the eunuchs had already secured positions of power within the court and the military, becoming essential players in the empire's political landscape. Zhang Rang, one of the most powerful eunuchs at the time, along with his colleagues, controlled the emperor's decisions, using him as a mere puppet. This corruption at the heart of the empire deeply destabilized the Han government, as the eunuch's greed and manipulation spread like a disease, undermining the principles of merit and justice that had once defined the Han Dynasty. Simultaneously, the rise of military warlords such as Dongzhuo and Cao Cao further eroded imperial authority. Dongzhuo's seizure of the capital, Luoyang, in 189 AD, marked the beginning of the military leader's direct control over the empire. With the emperor weak and surrounded by eunuchs who had no interest in curbing the military's growing power, the warlords took matters into their own hands. Dongzhuo, initially acting as a regent for the emperor, quickly turned into a tyrant, exercising unprecedented control over the state. The warlord factions, with their own armies and independent agendas, were no longer merely military leaders. They were the true rulers of China. Their military dominance effectively meant that the emperor's power was symbolic, as warlords like Cao Cao sought to shape imperial policy to serve their own personal and political goals. The emperor's abdication in 220 AD, following the forced surrender to Cao Pi, son of Cao Cao, marked the formal collapse of the Han Dynasty. This moment was the culmination of a long process in which the central authority of the Han imperial throne had eroded. The emperor, having witnessed the unfolding chaos, was forced to relinquish his imperial title, passing it to Cao Pi, whose military might had already ensured his dominance. Emperor Xian's abdication was not an act of power. It was the end of power, a silent surrender that sealed the fate of the Han Dynasty and ushered in the era of the Three Kingdoms. The eunuchs and warlords, both of whom had contributed to the emperor's powerlessness, played a significant role in the disintegration of the Han Empire. The eunuchs, who had once been seen as loyal servants of the emperor, had become the architects of his downfall. They manipulated imperial succession, placed their allies in key government positions, and used their control over the imperial family to consolidate power. Their corruption and greed drained the imperial treasury and sparked widespread discontent within the court. The emperor's weakness was, in many ways, a reflection of the eunuchs' increasing dominance over the imperial system. On the other hand, the warlords, with their private armies and independent territories, further fragmented the empire. Cao Cao, in particular, took advantage of the weakened imperial authority, aligning himself with the eunuchs and court officials when it suited him, while maintaining an iron grip on northern China. His increasing military influence and strategic alliances allowed him to slowly usurp imperial power. The rise of Xiao Pai, a warlord with a vast military network, and his eventual claim to the imperial title in 220 AD marked the definitive end of the Han Dynasty's centralized power. Fragmentation of power into warlord factions that had once been loyal generals now reflected a fractured empire that had lost its cohesion and moral authority. This collapse of imperial authority also came with personal consequences. for those who opposed the eunuchs or the warlords. Many court officials, military leaders, and even members of the imperial family faced execution or exile for their opposition to the new political order. Those who dared to challenge the eunuchs or the warlords risked not only losing their position, but their lives. The concentration of power in the hands of the military and the eunuchs made the Han court a place where factionalism and violence ruled the day, and those who lost favor with the right people were quickly removed. In the end, Emperor Xian's reign was a sad reflection of the fragility of power in the Han Dynasty. Eunuchs and warlords had turned the emperor into a puppet, unable to prevent the fragmentation of the empire that had once been unified under his ancestors. His abdication was not a choice. It was a forced concession to the forces of corruption and military ambition. The fall of the Han was not the result of one decisive blow, but a gradual decay that had begun decades earlier, when the empire's internal political factions slowly began to chip away at its core. By the time Emperor Xian was forced to abdicate, the Han Dynasty's disintegration was inevitable. As the once mighty empire splintered into the warring states that would come to define the Three Kingdoms period. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD stands as one of the most defining and tragic moments in the history of the Han Dynasty. What began as a religious movement rooted in Taoist ideals, promising a world of peace, fairness, and benevolence, would explode into an all-encompassing uprising that would rattle the very foundation of the once glorious empire. However, behind this rebellion lay a much deeper issue: the failure of the Han court, which had become increasingly disconnected from the people it claimed to govern. This rebellion wasn't simply a response to economic hardship or social oppression. It was the culmination of years of neglect, mismanagement, and corruption by the imperial leadership, which created a perfect storm for insurrection. The peasants in the Han Empire had suffered for years under a taxation system that demanded more than they could afford. The landowning class, with their unchecked power, exploited the labor of the poor, demanding higher rents and taxes, forcing many farmers into debt. The imperial bureaucracy, which should have protected these citizens, was instead caught in a cycle of corruption and mismanagement, dominated by the eunuchs at the heart of the court. As the imperial capital, Luoyang, became a playground for political infighting, the real needs of the people were ignored. The eunuchs and court officials played games of power, leaving the landless and downtrodden peasants to fend for themselves. The land, once fertile and prosperous, had become a symbol of the oppression and inequality that was rampant throughout the empire. The Han Dynasty, a once great power, had become so bloated and decayed by internal conflict that it could no longer even sustain its own people. It was into this environment of desperation and grievance that Zhang Jiao, a charismatic Taoist preacher, emerged. He wasn't just a rebel leader. He was a spiritual figure, offering hope to those who had none. Zhang Jiao's movement, the Yellow Turbans, espoused the belief that the Han emperors had lost the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, because they had failed their people. His teachings promised the restoration of balance in the empire, and his followers, drawn from the poorest segments of society, saw in his words a path to redemption. Zhang Jiao's rallying cry for a better world resonated deeply with the oppressed, and soon his movement spread across the empire like wildfire. What began as a small religious sect soon became a massive popular movement, with more than 200,000 rebels taking up arms in the name of justice and divine order. The Han court, deeply entrenched in its own internal struggles, failed to recognize the growing threat posed by the Yellow Turbans. When the rebellion finally erupted, the government was caught off guard. unprepared to face such a widespread and well-organized insurgency. As the rebels stormed towns, burned tax records, and freed prisoners, the imperial military was forced to respond, but their commanders were too disjointed and lacking in unity to mount a coherent defense. The rebellion spread rapidly, with multiple regions of the empire joining the Yellow Turbans in an effort to overthrow the ruling elite. Local officials and landlords were quickly overrun, and the imperial authority seemed unable to stem the tide of resistance. Even as the Han army mobilized against the rebellion, they were facing a far larger, more resilient force than they had anticipated. The rebellion's growth highlighted a massive disconnect between the ruling elite and the common people. The Han rulers, entrenched in their palaces and surrounded by wealth, had long ceased to see the suffering of their subjects as anything more than a distant inconvenience. The empire's internal struggles, fueled by eunuchs, factions, and imperial infighting, had created a profound power vacuum. While the emperor remained a puppet, his ministers and generals fought for their own personal gains, leaving the people vulnerable to the appeal of revolutionary forces. The peasants, having long been ignored, found in the Yellow Turbans a message of hope, while the elite were too wrapped up in their own power struggles to recognize the growing unrest until it was too late. The immediate consequences of the Yellow Turban Rebellion were nothing short of catastrophic for the Han Dynasty. The rebellion, though eventually suppressed, depleted the empire's resources, further undermined the central authority, and deepened the political fractures within the court. The Han military's failure to crush the rebellion with any degree of speed or decisiveness was a blow to the legitimacy of the imperial system, proving that the once mighty empire had become a shadow of its former self. The Han military, weakened by infighting and political corruption, could not effectively deal with the rebels, which led to the rise of local warlords, such as Cao Cao, who began to consolidate military power in their own hands. These warlords, once loyal to the emperor, now started to act with independence, further fragmenting the empire. The economic consequences were equally disastrous. As taxes rose to fund the military's response, the suffering of the peasants only deepened, pushing them further into poverty. The rural economy, already devastated by natural disasters, was now further crippled by war and the exploitation of landowners. With the Han central government unable to address these pressing issues, more peasants turned to rebellion, fueling further unrest. The rebellion exposed the flaws in the Han political system, which had long been unable to address the needs of its people. The Han Dynasty became synonymous with decay and failure, and the Yellow Turban Rebellion was just the first spark in the fire that would eventually lead to the division of the empire and the rise of the Three Kingdoms. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was more than just an uprising. It was a catalyst for the Han Dynasty's disintegration. It illuminated the deepening social divides, the failure of the emperor's authority, and the imperial collapse that was brewing beneath the surface. For the Han Dynasty, it was a brutal reminder that when the people's needs are ignored, when the elite are out of touch, the empire will be unraveled by the very masses they sought to control. The rebellion may have been crushed, but the seeds of division it sowed would continue to grow, eventually leading to the fragmentation of China into the warring Three Kingdoms, a legacy of an empire that had lost touch with its core. The collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220 AD was not just a political upheaval. It was the shattering of a centuries-old tradition, the unraveling of a structure that had bound China together for more than 400 years. For the people of China, the abdication of Empress Xian was not just a formal handover of power. It was the symbolic death of a dynasty that had once unified the Middle Kingdom. As the last emperor of the Han Dynasty, Emperor Xian's abdication marked the end of an era. But it also underscored a deeper psychological collapse that had been building within the empire. The emperor, once the living embodiment of the mandate of heaven, had been reduced to a puppet, his power stripped away by internal court intrigue, eunuch manipulation, and the rise of warlords. His abdication was the final admission that the Han Dynasty had failed, not only as a political entity, but as a symbol of unity for the Chinese people. Emperor Xian's abdication in 220 AD left the people of China reeling, unable to comprehend how a dynasty that had once controlled such vast territories could fall so completely. In the imperial court, the true rulers had long been the eunuchs, the court factions, and the military commanders, each vying for influence, but none willing to preserve the unity of the empire. The emperor, far from being a unifying force, had become a puppet under their control, his decisions dictated by those who held the real power. The Han imperial system, founded on principles of Confucian virtue and centralized authority, had crumbled under the weight of corruption, inefficiency, and the disintegration of imperial governance. To the common people, Emperor Xian's abdication represented not only the end of the Han Dynasty, but the failure of the imperial system to protect them. With Emperor Xian's abdication, the Han Dynasty's unification of China came to an end, replaced by the rise of the three kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu. The great expanse of land once controlled by the Han emperors was now fragmented into the territories of ambitious warlords, each carving out his own empire. At the heart of this transformation was Cao Cao, the warlord who, after years of struggle, consolidated his control over northern China. Cao Cao's rise was not just a military conquest. It was a shrewd political maneuver that involved the manipulation of the imperial court and a willingness to seize power at any cost. As the most powerful of the warlords, Cao Cao was not content with merely ruling his territory. His ultimate goal was the restoration of the Han under his rule, though he ultimately placed his son Cao Pi on the throne in 220 AD, marking the beginning of the Wei Kingdom. Liu Bei, a distant relative of the imperial family, had a very different vision. His claim to power rested not just on military strength, but on his ancestry and his connection to the fallen Han legacy. For Liu Bei, the fall of the Han was a tragic event, and his rise to power was framed not merely as the creation of a new kingdom, but as the restoration of the Han ideal. His kingdom of Shu in the southwest was founded on the principles of benevolence, justice, and a moral governance that contrasted sharply with the military autocracies of the other warlords. With his trusted advisors, particularly the brilliant strategist Zhuge Liang, Liu Bei sought to unite the people of the south under a banner of Han legitimacy, though the constant pressure from Cao Cao and other factions would make this ideal ever more elusive. Meanwhile, in the southeast, Sun Quan and the Wu Kingdom emerged as a significant force. Unlike Cao Cao and Liu Bei, Sun Quan was less concerned with the restoration of the Han Dynasty and more focused on securing his own domain. The port city of Jianye, modern-day Nanjing, became the heart of Wu's strength, providing an essential naval power that made Sun Quan a formidable force in the empire. He was a pragmatist, aligning with Liu Bei at times to face the greater threat of Cao Cao, but always careful to maintain his independence. Sun Quan's rise represents the shift from a centralized empire to a more fragmented world, where loyalty to the throne was secondary to regional control and self-preservation. The rise of these warlords, Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan, signaled the end of a unified China under the Han. They each ruled over their own territories, fighting not only for control of land and resources, but also for moral authority and legitimacy. The once unified empire had been replaced by three competing kingdoms, each with its own ambitions, policies, and visions for the future. In the absence of a strong imperial system, power was now decentralized, and the idea of a unified China under a single emperor was forever lost. The collapse of the Han Dynasty and the rise of the Three Kingdoms represented not just a political change, but a profound transformation in how China was governed. The fall of the Han symbolized the failure of centralized authority and the rise of a new world of regional powers. The legacy of the Han Dynasty, which had once symbolized unity and strength, was now fractured into three competing states, each vying for power, each struggling to define China's future. The people. This was a time of great uncertainty, a time when the dream of imperial unity was shattered, and the land was divided by forces that cared more for their own ambitions than the legacy of the empire. The Han Dynasty, one of the most influential empires in Chinese history, left a legacy that reverberates throughout the cultural, political, and social fabric of modern China. For over 4 centuries, the Han emperors guided the empire to prosperity, creating a system that was rooted in Confucian ideals and meritocratic governance, which would influence later dynasties like the Tang, Song, and Qing. However, by 220 AD, when Emperor Xian was forced to abdicate, the collapse of the Han Dynasty was not just a political event, it was a fundamental shift in how China would be governed for centuries to come. The abandonment of centralized power, the rise of warlords, and the corruption within the imperial court marked the fall of an empire that had once unified China under a single throne. The psychological impact of Emperor Xian's abdication on the people was profound. For over 400 years, the Han emperors had symbolized the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. The emperor was not just a ruler, he was the moral and political center of the empire, the embodiment of order and justice. But as the Han Dynasty entered its final years, the emperors had become mere figureheads, controlled by the eunuchs, regional warlords, and court factions. By 220 AD, when Emperor Xian handed the throne to Cao Pi, the last shred of Han legitimacy was gone. The people who had once looked to the emperor for guidance were now faced with the reality of a fragmented empire, divided between rival warlords and factions, each claiming the right to rule. In the immediate aftermath of Emperor Xian's abdication, the collapse of the Han Dynasty gave rise to the Three Kingdoms, Wei, Shu, and Wu, 3 rival states that would define Chinese politics for the next few centuries. But while the Three Kingdoms period brought with it a new political order, it also symbolized the end of imperial unity. The warlords, Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and Sun Quan, each carved out their own territories, replacing the once strong, centralized rule of the Han with regional powers. Their rise was not just the result of military conquest. It was a reflection of the weakness of the imperial system and the failure of the Han leadership to maintain the unity of the empire. Cao Cao, the most powerful warlord of the three, was a master strategist and a ruthless politician. Through a series of clever alliances, military conquests, and political maneuverings, he consolidated control over northern China. Cao Cao's ambition was clear. He sought to reunite China under his rule, but his methods alienated many. His autocratic rule, the heavy taxation, and the oppression of local officials created resentment, particularly among the common people and the scholars who had once upheld Han ideals. Despite his ambition, Cao Cao's rise was marred by the increasing distance between his leadership and the Han tradition he sought to restore. His rise marked not just the end of the Han, but the beginning of a new political era defined by warrior kings and regional power struggles. In contrast, Liu Bei, who claimed descent from the imperial family, was seen by many as the rightful heir to the Han legacy. His rise to power was built on his image as a benevolent and moral leader, deeply rooted in the Confucian ideals of virtue and justice. Liu Bei's ambition was not to destroy the Han, but to restore it. His kingdom, Shu, in the southwestern part of China, represented a resistance to the power of Cao Cao and the imperial system's decay. But while Liu Bei's vision for a restored Han Dynasty was idealistic, his reign was fraught with struggle, military challenges, and internal conflict. The reality of ruling in a fragmented, war-torn world meant that Liu Bei's vision could never fully be realized. The third warlord, Quan, took control of Wu, a strategically located kingdom along the Yangtze River. Wu's geography gave it a crucial naval advantage, allowing Quan to maintain a vibrant economy and military power. However, Quan's rise to power was more about strategic survival than ambition for empire. Unlike Cao Cao and Liu Bei, Quan was more pragmatic, choosing to consolidate his power and defend his kingdom from the encroaching threats of the other two warlords. His kingdom's independence allowed him to preserve some form of unity in southern China, but Quan, like his rivals, ultimately became part of the fragmented world of the three kingdoms, where the ideals of Han centralization were lost forever. The rise of the three kingdoms was a profound shift in Chinese history. The Han, which had once been the symbol of centralized power, was now replaced by three competing factions, each vying for control of a fractured land. This new reality was the result of the failure of the Han leadership to maintain the imperial unity that had made the dynasty so strong in the past. The lesson of the Han dynasty's rise and fall is clear. Leadership matters. The Han emperors had once brought stability and order to China, but their inability to adapt to the changing political landscape, their failure to address corruption, and their lack of strong, unified leadership ultimately led to the disintegration of their empire. Another lesson is that governance requires balance between centralization and local autonomy, between the power of the emperor and the reality of regional needs. The Han dynasty's fall was marked by the increasing dominance of regional warlords, whose power grew at the expense of the emperor's authority. The balance of power between centralized rule and local control was broken, leading to the fragmentation of the empire. And perhaps the most important lesson is that human nature, especially greed, ambition, and corruption, will always play a decisive role in the success or failure of an empire. The Han rulers, like all emperors before and after, were subject to human frailty, whether it was the imperial court's intrigue, the eunuch's corruption, or the power struggles between factions and warlords. These flaws, left unchecked, would bring down even the mightiest of empires. The Han dynasty's collapse was not just a political event, it was a cultural turning point. It reshaped China's political landscape, leading to a new world of regional competition, but it also left behind a legacy of governance and cultural ideals that would influence the future of the empire. In the end, the fall of the Han teaches us that empires, no matter how powerful, are always fragile, and their survival depends not just on military strength, but on the wisdom and virtue of their leaders. The Han dynasty, which spanned over 4 centuries from 206 BC to 220 AD, stands as one of the greatest and most enduring empires in world history. From its humble beginnings in the aftermath of the Qin dynasty's collapse, the Han rose to establish an era of political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing. It laid the foundations for what would become the enduring legacy of imperial China, a civilization defined by its centralized governance, Confucian principles, and an unwavering commitment to the mandate of heaven. But even the most powerful empires are not immune to the ravages of time, and as history teaches us, all empires, no matter how vast or majestic, eventually face decline. The collapse of the Han Dynasty was not a singular event, but rather a slow erosion of the imperial system. It began with the eunuchs gaining undue influence within the imperial court, manipulating the weak emperors and eventually fracturing the once unshakable control of the throne. It was compounded by the rise of military factions, regional warlords, and a power struggle within the court that distracted from the needs of the people and the governance of the state. By the time Emperor Xian abdicated in 220 AD, the Han Dynasty had already been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Its centralized power disbanded, its imperial legitimacy all but lost. The fall of the Han Dynasty was not merely a political event, it was a profound shift in the cultural and moral fabric of China. As we reflect on the Han Dynasty's rise and collapse, we are reminded of the cyclical nature of history, how all empires, no matter how mighty, inevitably face decline. It's a reminder that power is fragile and must be carefully nurtured and protected. The rise of the Han Dynasty was grounded in the wisdom of Emperor Gaozu and his successors, who built a government that was meritocratic, Confucian in its principles, and deeply focused on centralized control. Yet, as the empire expanded, the very systems that had once provided stability began to show cracks. Corruption, the rise of regional autonomy, and the failure of leadership all contributed to the eventual disintegration of the Han, leaving behind a fragmented empire of warring warlords. The Han's downfall offers important lessons about leadership and governance that resonate even today. The Han emperors were initially successful because they understood the value of strong, central leadership and ethical rule. But as the dynasty aged, power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, and the system of checks and balances that had once worked so well faltered. This breakdown in leadership was not only a result of individual failings, but also of a system that had failed to adapt to the changing political landscape. When power is centralized in the hands of a few, and when bureaucratic systems become bloated and self-serving, the foundation of any empire is weakened. The Han Dynasty's collapse shows how the fragility of leadership, if unchecked by accountability and ethical governance, can cause even the greatest empire to crumble. Moreover, the Han Dynasty's fall teaches us about the limits of power. Human nature, ambition, greed, and the desire for control plays a crucial role in shaping the fate of any dynasty. The Han rulers, despite their great achievements, were not immune to the corrupting influence of power. The rise of the eunuchs and the military warlords demonstrated that even the most well-established systems can be undone when corruption becomes ingrained within the ruling structure. It was the internal fragmentation of the Han court, coupled with the decay of leadership, that set the stage for the rise of the three kingdoms. Yet, in reflecting on the Han Dynasty's legacy, we are reminded that history is not defined solely by the fall of empires, but by how their ideas, values, and innovations endure. The Han Dynasty's contributions to governance, such as the establishment of Confucianism as state ideology, the meritocratic civil service system, and the promotion of education, have left an indelible mark on Chinese society. Even after the empire fractured and the three kingdoms rose, the cultural and philosophical legacies of the Han continued to shape China's imperial structure, guiding future generations of rulers. The Han Dynasty's fall, though painful and dramatic, was not the end of its legacy. Instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter in Chinese history. The rise of the three kingdoms and the division of China might have shattered the unity of the Han Empire, but it also paved the way for the continuation of many Han ideals. The Han's collapse marked the end of a unified empire, but the values of governance, order, and unity they championed would continue to influence China's political system for centuries to come. In the long arc of history, the fall of the Han Dynasty is just one chapter, but it serves as a powerful reminder that no empire is eternal. The rise and fall of the Han Dynasty teaches us that the nature of power is not only about control, but about leadership that remains accountable, ethical, and adaptable. It reminds us that the human tendency to seek power can be both a driving force for greatness and the catalyst for decline. It teaches us that the end of an empire is not the end of history, but rather a moment of transformation, where the ideas and principles that defined it continue to shape the future. The lessons of the Han Dynasty are not just about the impermanence of power, but about the resilience and continuity of ideas. History moves in cycles, and while empires may rise and fall, the wisdom and cultural achievements they leave behind endure, shaping the course of human civilization for centuries to come. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.